Welcome to a brand new episode of IDTALK4ED Educators Live, the show for the unsung heroes of education. I'm your host, Kwame Sarfo-Mensah. If this is your first time tuning in to the podcast, we welcome you and we hope that you return for future episodes. If you are a returning viewer or listener, we welcome you back and we hope that tonight's episode is one that you find enlightening and informative. But before we introduce tonight's guest, which is a special one, we want to do a few announcements. First and foremost, we have our Identity Talk Apparel shop, and we have some new collections that are in the shop. We have one for our school librarians who are holding it down and still providing knowledge through the books for our scholars. And we have a new collection for our principals and school leaders who have been holding down the fort during this pandemic. So to check out our new collections, both the Stay True to the Principal and You collection and the School Librarians Are Educators Too collection, check us out at our Teespring store at teespring.com/stores/the Identity Talk Apparel shop. And then for our people who are looking for professional development opportunities, we have our virtual Shape the Teacher Identity 101 program. So if you are looking to get professional development in culturally responsive and anti-racist practices, family engagement, parental engagement, classroom management, teacher identity, among many other modules, this is the program for you. And here's the best part about it. You get professional development credits that will go towards a license. Doesn't get any better than that. So if you're interested in building your capacity as an educator and getting some credits, feel free to book a call with us at calendly.com/IdentityTalk 4 educators. So those are our announcements. Now let's get to our main event. We have here today an all-around good guy, somebody who has a wealth of knowledge when it comes to teacher education and just disrupting spaces. He's an educator, philanthropist, and he is an adjunct professor currently at Portland State University. So he's out in the Pacific Northwest. And this is actually his podcast debut. So he's more of a behind the scenes type of person, but today he's going to put himself out there and it's going to be an excellent conversation. So let's please welcome Mr. Ben Bruhn to our podcast. Let's welcome the gentleman. Hey, how you doing, man?
I'm glad to be here.
Yeah, I'm glad to have you. We've been trying to get this thing together for a minute. I'm glad that the day's here, and I'm ready to go right in because we have a lot to talk about. So the first thing I want to ask you is this, and this is the first question I ask all my guests. Just tell us a little bit about yourself and what ultimately brought you into the field of education.
Yeah, so I grew up in Seattle area. I'm a triplet, so 2 boys and a girl. I'm the oldest by 1 minute, and it's been a journey. So I actually didn't know I was going to be a teacher for a while. I grew up in an immigrant area of Seattle, and so that exposed me to a lot of different cultures. I was just really curious about, community development. It actually led me to do my bachelor's in theology and history. Just wanted to know people's story so that when I was looking to do humanitarian work, and in doing that, I didn't want it to be divorced from understanding their culture, of course. So it always humbled me to study that. And so my main focus after college was humanitarian stuff. I had done that in the summers, helping, a friend start an orphanage in Uganda, worked with helping job training in inner city St. Louis. But really a formative experience for me was living with the Indian immigrant community in London for over a year, where, 98% of them were, Indian immigrants in that area of London. So I actually got to know their culture way more than British culture. But through that experience and just other traveling, it really just showed me that disconnect between, students' identity and school, and them having a code switch and not seeing any connection really to their lives. So that was for me kind of that shift as a career into teaching, was really going into teaching, wanting education to be a mirror and a window where students learn more about themselves through the process of really seeing more of the world in a different way. So I got my master's in teaching at University of Washington. I knew I needed tools in my toolbox to see teaching as a craft. And so I did that up in Seattle, and that kind of this got me started. It was actually really cool to go back to the community I grew up in and start teaching there in Seattle. And so my first 4 years of teaching was pretty, urban education focused, mostly non-white spaces. And then the last 5 years have been really the opposite, kind of semi-rural areas and pretty white in general. So I've been in 6 different schools, started off in middle school, been mostly high school, language arts, ELL students, and primarily social studies.
Cool. So with regard to just the transition from a more urban educational setting to a rural setting, was that a difficult switch or transition for you? And what are some of those differences that you experienced as you made that transition?
Yeah, no, that's a great question, because in some ways I feel like I'm still learning and adapting. Yeah, so the biggest thing was just a lot of conversations that I assumed were happening weren't happening. So I assumed my students were talking about like their identity, and I assumed that they had all this exposure. And some of that I knew right away, just looking out at my classroom, was very different. But it was also new for me I felt like a rookie teacher again, thinking, how do I teach when that representation is not present? And what's my own positionality in that? How do I create a space for the few minorities represented to feel safe? And how do I do that in a larger system and a larger school environment that isn't really having those conversations either? So it was a rough transition, I'll be honest, especially because I had done alternative ed. And so my classes were like 15, 20 students and a lot more relational culture. And then going back to general education, mostly white, where my smallest class the first year was 38 students. Yeah, it was tough. But it also just helped me know why a lot of that work was needed, because it just wasn't happening for the most part.
Wow. Okay. Yeah. And that's a lot to have to navigate, when you're making that transition. So I can't even imagine, just how difficult it may have been for you to have to juggle those different factors as you were making that transition. So eventually you end up adjuncting at Portland State University. So you've already have a number of years of classroom experience under your belt, and now you're helping other teacher candidates get their footing, in the classroom. So I want to know from you, as an adjunct professor, what are some of the specific roles that you play in supporting and mentoring pre-service teachers who are entering? And I know your specialty is in social studies education, correct?
Yeah.
Yeah. So how do you mentor and support those teachers who are going into social studies education specifically?
Yeah, for sure. So, I mean, first off, just the nuts and bolts was my entry point was actually co-teaching with another teacher. I had gotten to know them through different conferences I had presented at. And so they've been out of the field for like 20, 30 years. And they wanted me to first kind of be a guest speaker in their methods class. And then when there was a larger cohort of students, they said, hey, we need more help to keep up the quality of our program. Would you be interested in co-teaching? And so that was my foot in the door. And so one real blessing at Portland State is we don't have to teach them to a test. There isn't a massive exam at the end of their master's program that they have to pass. Instead, it's more of a portfolio called the EdTPA. And it still can be stressful. And I still, will raise questions around, is that authentic instruction? How is it being assessed? And I'm transparent with the students around that too, and invite them into that conversation. But I mentioned that because it really frees us in 3 classes, 3 different quarters, where we can really just focus on pedagogy instead of needing to teach content. So in that, I can just focus on the skills. And so my role in a lot of ways is just to focus on the pedagogy. But in being an adjunct, my main piece coming in is to connect a lot of gaps between theory and practice, and also kind of call out things that are missing in the program, or at least what I know Courtney had mentioned earlier with you around just that it can be so segmented. They compartmentalize what's going on, and they don't see how it integrates. So they have like an assessment class, but they're not seeing how that connects to their adolescent development class, or how that connects to, thinking about the larger public policy issues in education. So a lot of times I try to purposely weave those in and collaborate with other colleagues to just bring that into a conversation instead of them, because I just see them once a week. It can be really easy for them to switch hats rather than actually seeing this as an integrated experience.
Right. And if you're only meeting your colleagues just once a week, I can imagine it's hard to really generate synergy as a team and to ensure that everybody is on the same page and on that same wavelength as far as how you instruct your different pre-service teachers, because you might have some ideological differences in terms of how you think about the content, which then leads to conflict. And I know you and I, we've talked off air about just how it's hard to disrupt when you may have like tenured professors and other people within the institution of academia who may not feel the way you feel because of their frame of reference. So how are you able to negotiate those type of conversations to where there's a consensus of thought around how you're going to approach your pre-service teachers?
Yeah, I've really been able to approach it similar to how I approach talking to my own department at my high school, is just being really student-centered. So in this case, really focusing on the teacher candidates and listening to them, creating space for them to give authentic feedback, and then sharing that feedback. So it's not me guessing what they need or guessing what they want, but when I can show other people, hey, this is what they're saying, this is what they need, this is what they want, this is what they're confused about, how are we meeting that need? And if we don't have a plan, we need to talk about that. So I think a lot of times that has been my bridge, both in K-12 education and higher ed, is if I can focus on that shared interest in supporting future teachers and equipping future teachers, then a lot of times there becomes an openness to surrendering their precious textbook, or to consider a different resource, or just the time. So realizing if we are meeting once a week for 3 hours, how are we using that time, and creating space for a relationship, creating space for a voice in those 3 hours. And so I think even just shifting some current structures in a way where they recognize, like, is this in the best interest of our candidates? And if it's not, then there's more openness to change.
Oh, okay.
But some specific ways has been nice of in that feedback is then I can use that to really justify rewriting a syllabus, or bringing in different perspectives, bringing in different guest speakers. Like this year, it was great. I have a cousin who teaches other future social studies teachers in Colorado. And so we actually were both virtual. And so we actually mixed our 2 classes for a night. And so our teachers in Oregon were talking to teachers in Colorado, and they were able to just share their perspective on how is your practicum going? How is it different in Colorado? What are you learning? What are we learning? And just trying to show them that collaborative process, and also show like that's lifelong in their career, that I'm learning from from my cousin, and we're having conversations, and that I enjoy that process because it helps me continue to grow. And so they know that there's really no end to their growth, when it can be so easy for them to think of it as a checklist, and they're busy in their program, instead of thinking this is really just an organic, dynamic process to continue learning and unlearning and learning. So that's been helpful to just kind of model for them explicitly. And then one specific text that we've grounded all 3 quarters in, instead of having 4 books, is now just one smaller book, but it really packs a punch, just called Preparing to Teach Social Studies for Social Justice. And what's nice about that text is the editors basically, interviewed and took letters from over 20 different educators in the country who are all teaching social justice. They don't always agree on what that means. And that's okay. Like, disagreement is okay. But also it calls out that there's no neutrality. Like, teaching is political. That there is no, and that automatically will disrupt like a lot of the white supremacist norms of being objective, of that there's only one right way, of individualism. So a lot of those things we can call out in class because of having that book on the syllabus and actually using it in a way that makes their learning in the classroom and in the practicum a bit more authentic.
Wow. And with regard to just social justice, because social justice is such a broad term, and people tend to pick and choose what aspect of social justice they want to focus on. There's some that want to focus more on the sexual identity part of it. Some want to focus more on the race part of it. Some want to focus on the class part of it, right? So I think when you look at social justice as a broad term, depending on how people view it and approach it, is going to inform their pedagogy or the way that they instruct their kids within social studies. So is that something that you notice with certain folks who do teach social studies?
Yeah, for sure. And, like we've talked about on air in different other places, it changes over time. Like when I was in grad school in 2011, our program focused on social justice. Now most programs will say that it's kind of a catch-all. It's, kind of like equity, culturally responsive teaching, and now anti-racism or multicultural education. And a lot of those terms get interpreted different ways. So one way we've just opened up at least the last 2 years, our very first class with these students, the very first question we have them discuss is, what is social justice? And just kind of letting them have that space to just see the wide range of interpretations and ways that they justify their interpretation or back it up. And we use that intentionally so that they know that that you need space for that discomfort, space for disagreement, and that how are you showing up in that conversation? So, because it's adults in that space, I'm not really needed as much to facilitate that conversation, but we'll point that out really in a debrief of this. And like, if you haven't thought about your identity and what could be influencing your identity and how that could be showing up in this conversation, you need to, and that kind of work is necessary. Because as obviously for this podcast, like just being aware of your identity, are you prepared to show up so students can show up? And if that's not happening, then why are you there? Why are you in that space? So we hit it out of the gates of social justice, and the goal isn't to come to consensus on one definition or one interpretation. There are certainly themes, and that's what is helpful, is even if there's a wide range of experiences with that and hopes or fears with that term, a lot of times it does create, it begins the conversation around our classroom culture, which would be very different than if we just jumped into the syllabus and didn't have that kind of conversation.
Okay. And that's probably a great way to put it too, because so I guess from what you're saying, is the goal to have that intellectual chaos, if you will, in the beginning, where everybody is at a different vantage point as it relates to their idea of social justice. And then over the course of time, as you engage in discourse through different literature and through different exercises, you will arrive at maybe not consensus, but you'll come across some common themes that you all can agree with as a collective and say, you know what? Yeah, this definitely looks like social justice. I can rock with this definition or this part of it. Even though we may have some disagreement with certain aspects of it, there is some sense of commonality around certain themes that we've discovered through our own learning discovery.
Yeah, totally. It's well put. Just, yeah, because that's really the goal of it, is to both open up curiosity and confusion and like letting them sit with that. And I do the same thing with like my high school students. When I start off a unit, most of the time I want to, cause a little bit of confusion. I definitely want to create a lot of curiosity. But if I buttoned all that up and it was in a nice box and package for them on day one, then there's really no buy-in to explore anything or learn anything and moving forward. So even for these adult educators, our teacher candidates, is a lot of times, that funneling or that narrowing and that clarifying, we hope will happen through their practicum, through our ongoing discussions. So we meet in the winter and the fall and the spring. So really in the spring is when most of them have completed the bulk of their practicum. They've completed that EdTPA portfolio, and we're looking ahead toward their, they're applying for jobs. So during that quarter is when we really, push them to clarify for you as an educator, how are you defining social justice for your students? How are you defining it for yourself? What does that mean when you're creating and crafting your curriculum? And so again, day one, back in the fall, a lot of them are looking for the one right way. What's the way to teach? What's the way to approach this?
Right.
And it's nice to just let them be confused and say, we're not going to tell you one way to do this. Because that's as an organic process. And so really for me, the spring is when that's really exciting. And just like with students, I'm not going to purposely avoid giving them advice or guidance until then, but I'm going to encourage them to stay curious and lean into that discomfort, so that they remain open.
No, for sure. And you mentioned the fact that a lot of teacher candidates enter these programs looking for that one way. What's the correct way, or what's the algorithmic way of teaching in the classroom? And I think that's one of the issues with teacher education as a whole, is this idea of, just this one shoe fits all model that has been promoted, over the years. So I'm just wondering from you, within the context of social studies right now, and we could talk about teaching education as a whole, but within the context of social studies education, outside of just the different definitions of social justice and the different trains of thought around that, what do you believe are some of the other gaps that exist in social studies education specifically?
Yeah, well, I wrote this down because I could talk a lot on these gaps here, but I did want to just highlight, 3 specific gaps. So the first one, I'm always conscious of in going to a new space, when I've just hired, but it's just that identity gap. So, like 85% plus of educators identify as white. And that's not representative of the broader population. It's definitely not representative of youth, of students, where like 45% identify as white. And of course that varies nationally. That even varies locally. So I've taught in cities where I grew up, where most of the schools in my neighborhood growing up were 90 to 95% non-white, even though Seattle is way, way, way white. So that could really vary, but that's just an identity gap. And so I think that we should feel uncomfortable as an educator, like, why is that happening? What about this field is causing that gap? What about the system is causing that gap? So we could dig into that, but that's a huge gap that I'm explicit with my students about, because as we know, and they can connect with this, like it's hard to be what you can't see. And so just trying to, encourage them. And that's why I bring in a lot of guest speakers to just call that out explicitly. And that's beyond just, race, ethnicity, that's also a lot of different, religious identity and gender. And so bringing in those voices so that students know, like, hey, even those are not very well represented in our school right now, we still have space for their perspective, and those are important. So identity gap, a big one is the pedagogy gap. There's a big gap between theory and practice. I know Courtney and other guests you've had on have talked about that too, where most teacher candidates are on their own really trying to translate this pedagogy and theory into their specific practicum or their specific school. And a lot of times their cooperating teacher may not be equipped to have that conversation. Maybe they haven't done that in their own work. And then I know, as you've brought up, who are the theorists that they're studying? What voices are they hearing and that's informing them? And so if they're not getting that experience, then they can't pass it on to their students either. So identity gap, a gap in their pedagogy. And then another one is just a real division in the purpose of school. And that will divide other educators, and I don't think it's talked about enough. But I wanted to give a shout out to David Laborie. In 2004, had written a book called The Trouble with Ed Schools. And he just identified, like, there's 3 different purposes, and these go back like hundreds of years. But like, is it for social mobility? Like, I'm just in school to get rich. Is it about just job creation and the community? And like that buy-in, what does the community need? Like a social efficiency. This is just, you're just part of this industrial system, and you need to kind of go back and just support that. Or really what I could just call like change makers. He calls it democratic equality. But I call it change makers, where, realizing, is the purpose like empowering youth? The problem with, that's the one I like the most. The problem, of course, in that is, how are you empowering them, and how are you defining that empowerment? So I think a lot of times that empowerment can kind of be too soft if it's just civic education, and you think you can speak up, but you can't protest. You can, you can vote, but you shouldn't, buck the system too much. You can critique the system, but saying dismantle, that's too far. And so I think that's where there can be a lot of division, even within talk about critical pedagogy or critical literacy or social justice. Is, I think a lot of us want to equip our students to be change makers, but our system doesn't support it. Like, our system is mainly designed for compliance. It's not designed for connection.
Right.
And so students are taught how to comply, and they look ahead at being an adult, and they look at how is power distributed and how is it gained and maintained. Most of it's compliance. They don't see connection. They don't see, grassroots efforts being supported and endorsed, from the top. A lot of those, they see a lot of power over and under, but it kind of blows their mind to think about power with. And so a lot of times in my classroom, that can show up for teachers where, with behavior management, it just becomes this power dynamic of I'm over you, you're under me. And it shifts when you talk about it's with, like, I'm with you in this. That doesn't mean I have no authority, of course, but again, just trying to prioritize connection for a lot of people in education, like that really disrupts the system, and the foundation too around the purpose. Is the purpose just compliant citizens who, fit into a system of industrialism that was built hundreds of years ago? That the world has changed and has continued to change. And so that's where I think when they have space in my classroom, and I try to do this for my teacher candidates too, like, what do you want to change? What do you want to create? How are you showing up in these spaces? And that empowerment language, I think a lot of times isn't happening, or if it is happening, we're still confining it and constricting it. And so there's no real space for honest curiosity. And kids will call that out. They're like, so you want to empower me, but you won't let me do these things. And again, I think that's when teachers can fall back to the habit and our job description, which again promotes compliance more than connection. And so when you try to bring in restorative justice, you try to talk about anti-racism, that's really bucking a system that wasn't designed for those conversations.
Wow. No, and I pretty much am with you with every single point you made. I mean, you couldn't be more right about that. So let's stay on that for a second, because part of bucking the system is decolonizing it, right? Because we understand that the way it's structured is rooted in white supremacy or white nationalism, right? So I want to know from you, as a professor, as someone who is in academia, at an adjunct capacity,
Right,
but still in academia, what are some actions that colleges, universities, and residencies and other institutions of higher learning can take to start the process of decolonizing their programs?
Yeah, I think a lot of it has to start, I think just like with changes in K to 12 is you can't expect what you don't model. And so I just know, like, I am becoming more and more aware of like my own need to decolonize my consciousness. What are ways that I've just been in this own fishbowl and I'm not even seeing the water? And so just recognizing like, oh, wow, like I hadn't even considered this or that. And a lot of it, I think, is also expanding our definitions. So expanding like a definition of racism, or expanding the definition of white supremacy. Because I think a lot of times white supremacy, we think it's back in the day, KKK, or we think that those are the extremists who are like climbing walls and marching on the Capitol. That there's no way that's me, which is a lot different than like digging into some work that's already been done, where people have already dissected white supremacy in a way to normalize it. So just knowing like, oh, meritocracy. Oh, like that's a myth? I didn't know that. I've always been told anybody can be anything. And realizing like, oh, actually, maybe that's a myth. And I'd never even considered that. Or either or thinking, like recognizing like, oh, I assumed like both and can kind of blow your mind. Or individualism. So a lot of these other, traits of white supremacy that when you look at the traits, they don't look as evil. They don't look as daunting or scary when you realize, right, oh, these are built into our HR policies. These are built into our board policies. These are built into my job description in defining professionalism. And so I think the more of just being able to call that out, not in a way that it's like an attack on someone's character, but just calling them to start seeing the water around them and just saying like, hey, what you're feeling right now for my teacher candidates, the pressure you feel to find the one right way to teach, that's actually part of a system. And there's other ways of doing that. And there are other people who've thought about an antidote to that. Or like and just different gear, like you've, had around people just talking about, oh yeah, like collaboration over competition. When that just blows your mind when you think, okay, group projects sound nice, but I'm stressed about getting my A. So I'm going to make sure I get my A, and I'm going to compete even within my group to have control. And so we don't even necessarily, highlight that as a tension in value, where we recognize, yeah, most of our society and capitalism and just the broader structures are designed for competition. They're not designed for collaboration. Even the grading system is designed for like this comparison rather than for growth. And so that's a real hard thing to like shift your mind around. But I try to pepper those in and just call it out. Not that it always has to be a big conversation, but just being able to kind of name what they're feeling, or even just name what I'm feeling. Like, I'm feeling this pressure now. You asked me a huge question, and I feel a sense of urgency. And that sense of urgency is just another kind of white norm value to give you an answer real quick. rather than the vulnerability of saying, I don't know how to answer your question right now. And I don't want to give you a crappy answer. So I need time. I want to get back to you later. Hold me accountable to that. Here's some general ideas, but it also gives value to that question instead of rushing to give an urgent answer. So at least for me, that's where I've been trying to decolonize my own consciousness, is thinking, what are ways that all these norms are just habits in my life? And how can I model dismantling that on just a personal level? Instead of rushing to think about it, oh, those are other people or it's the system, but knowing I can actually start dismantling it just by occupying the space in a different way. And so like maybe in my classroom, they're having a conversation that isn't happening somewhere else with it. But I think just calling that out and just being able to start seeing that in other places. And at least for me, I try to lead with curiosity instead of the judgment. And I guess that's an empathy piece of just trying to, I'm not going to be able to engage with my colleagues or my students if it's coming from judgment. And so just trying to be clear with myself, like, what's my motive here? Is it to judge them? Is it to shame them into this? Or am I actually inviting them into a more whole human experience? And if I'm inviting them, then I'm creating a space where they can show up, where they can be confused, where they can admit that they're curious, instead of feeling this pressure to conform or comply, or just the big beast of perfectionism that we cultivate in our society.
Wow. Now, you said so much there, but there are a few pieces that I definitely want to touch on. I think number one, this idea of meritocracy, right? As somebody who at one point believed in meritocracy, I always believed that, okay, if you have like the credentials, if you have the qualifications to do a certain job, then you should get a certain incentive, right? Or you should be at a certain position. So, and this is what blows my mind, because there are people who still believe in this idea of meritocracy. And I believe that that should be the ideal. That's just me. But if that's the case, why do we have affirmative action policies if it's really a meritocracy? Why do we have Title IX? Why do we still have women saying that they're not getting equal or even equitable pay to their male counterparts if it's really about meritocracy? So these are just a few examples,
right?
That kind of challenge this idea, right? And then also with regard to looking for that one way, and it goes back to a conversation that we've had on a number of occasions off air, where who's being centered in these programs, as far as the different theorists, as far as the different pedagogical practices, what's being centered in these programs that's forcing pre-service teachers to believe that, oh, this is the ideal way to go about instruction. This is the ideal way to interact with students. And just to give an example, really quick example, like I've worked in Title I schools that were predominantly Black and Latinx my entire career. And middle school kids, some of whom have dealt with different trials and tribulations. They have family members that have gone through the criminal justice system. They themselves have gone through, the juvenile system. I had kids coming into school with PO ankle bracelets. Like, that was my reality. So if a kid in my class is pretty much talking, right, and just going about their business, and they're not responding to me, I can't be like, all right, guys, please sit down, guys, please sit down, because they're not going to take me seriously. But that's what they tell us to do. They tell us to be respectful, not to raise your voice, not to not to curse, whatever. But you know what? There are times where I had to be like, okay, sit the fuck down. And they listen to me. And yes, Should I be using profanity in front of kids? They'll probably tell you in teacher ed class not to do that. I wouldn't say that it should be your first option, but given the context that I'm in and their upbringing, if Machiavelli said the ends justify the means, this is the very definition of it. You do what you have to do to get the results. Now, I'm not saying that that should be your first option, but if you're trying to dig into your bag of tools, you got to pull it out at some point, but I just don't abuse it. But that's just an example of how we need to how we just kind of stop restricting the way that we think about instruction, right? And this one way concept. So that just popped into my mind.
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah.
And I mean, ways that I've done that just in my own classroom is even just giving a shout out to different teachers. So like I go out of my way to like observe and hop in and collaborate or invite them into my spaces. And so it's helpful to just to show like, hey, like I hopped into this math class. Some of you have this teacher and I love how they do this. I love, their approach to this. And here's some things that I'm going to try out, but I'm not them. So, we'll see what sticks. I'm me, but like, I think it's awesome about this teacher. And then last week I went to go see this Spanish teacher and she's doing this. And so they can even see that there's not like one right teacher who is doing it the right way. Certainly there's going to be a lot of different commonality in terms of, like I mentioned, like the connection piece, centering student voice. I mean, there are going to be certain elements, but that's, again, like how I show it up is going to be different than someone else with that. And I think that like that humanity piece, I think is big. A lot of times just, I was talking in a book group a week ago or so with Channing White, and she had mentioned around like the moment I said sorry created space, or maybe it was Che, but one of them was saying like, yeah, when I said sorry to my student, it created space for that authenticity. Just knowing like, yeah, I mess up, you mess up, we're human. It's okay. And even that, that can be like a risk or a danger if you've learned the one way where you never show up to your students and you never show vulnerability. But again, that gets back to, for me, with my teacher candidates and my own students, like I can't ask them to do something I don't do. So if I'm asking them to have a growth mindset, am I modeling that? Am I having them teach me? And am I messing up and being willing to laugh about it instead of thinking it all has to go back to some guilt or shame? Because in a sense, am I modeling back to that perfectionist culture? Like, am I modeling that an alternative where I can mess up and it's okay. I can still grow. I'm not going to stay there. But giving yourself that grace.
Right. And I think it goes back to what you said about perfectionism and how perfectionism narrows the definition of what good teaching is, what good pedagogy is. We get so caught up in keeping things clean, keeping instruction clean, getting those objectives on the board, getting the borders around your bulletin board to make it look fancy. Like we get caught up in all these different things that they teach us, like actually teach us. But in the end, does it welcome new perspectives? Does it welcome fresh ideologies? So like you mentioned, you're an adjunct professor. You're bringing in different experiences that maybe tenure professors have never experienced before because they've been out of the classroom for so many years, right? So how do we get to a point where we are opening our minds enough to welcome these new perspectives and these new concepts and just ways of thinking about what good teaching is? And that's ultimately what we're trying to figure out.
Yeah. And it's big too, because again, those resources or perspectives, I find like if I'm not having my identity challenged in any learning environment, it's really hard for me to center those perspectives or at least bring them in. So I can have all kinds of, multicultural education, CRT work. And if I'm not if I'm not decolonizing my own consciousness, if I'm still trying to just have that be supplemental, oh, this is an appendices. So like, it's kind of this notes at the end of this, but the core of it, is still like my whiteness, and that's going to be preserved. And I think in teacher ed, that's the hard pressure of like the tests are designed to support whiteness. Like they're designed to, assess the one way of learning or the one way of teaching. And so I'm glad at Portland State where I don't have that as much pressure because of it being a portfolio that they are creating and developing. But yeah, I know in other states, they have a praxis test, and, that they have that added pressure where like, okay, a number of people of color I speak to, like they know, like I had to go into the test thinking, what would a white person say? How would they answer this? And that's how they have to navigate the system.
Wow.
And so I just know a number of my students consciously and unconsciously have to approach their classes that way too. What would my white teacher want me to say? Rather than like, do they actually want my words? Do they want me to show up on this essay or this project?
Wow. I mean, when you put it like that, I mean, man, it just makes perfect sense, because I was one who had to take the praxis when I was a teacher in Pennsylvania. But then when I went to Massachusetts, they have their own test. So I pretty much had to take all of those practice tests I took in Pennsylvania all over again in Massachusetts. Clean slate. And man, like when you think about just, wow, what would my white teacher want me to say? That's pretty much any test that the students take every year, the test that we have to take as educators to get our licensure every year. I mean, that's serious.
Yeah, I mean, it's built in. Like we've heard in a lot of spaces around like SAT, ACT testing, this college board structure. I mean, when I teach AP US history, I let them know like who is the college board, who's creating this, why was it created, and it even predicting, like having them predict, okay, what do you think they're going to tell you about this president? What do you predict they're going to want you to know about this time period? And then of course, like, well, what's missing? So what's stuff that they're not talking about? And why do you think they're not talking about it? And like, who's publishing this textbook? How would that be different in a different place or in a different country talking about it? But all that, again, is just, my goal of disrupting and being with them in it. Again, that power of knowing I'm still needing my consciousness disrupted because of my own education and my own exposure to resources.
No, yeah. And when you think about just the tests in general, we have to wonder, are we assessing intelligence or are we assessing compliance? I mean, that's ultimately the question.
Yeah. And a lot of it gets into, what we've talked about too, just how are you defining intelligence? So just, I mean, some of those tests have a really narrow definition of intelligence. And students internalize that. So just in terms of like, am I intelligent or not? Do I belong in this space? And like, even what comes to mind for them when they hear the word intelligent? And that starts early. I mean, like my son's 7, daughter's 2. And, there's so many messages that create whatever comes to their mind around that. So yeah, and that's one cool opportunity, I think, with the pandemic. This is silver lining, is realizing like, oh, if you don't have that gate up or the gatekeeper of saying, okay, you have to get this on the SAT, you have to take the ACT, and knowing, okay, maybe we don't. And if we don't, of course, there's money at stake. There's billions of dollars from companies that are losing out on their system with it. But also it forces that conversation of, if we don't have this test, if we don't have this gate, what will happen? And then it at least gets into that fear of knowing, okay, are we thinking about the intelligences that they're bringing into college or their career, or are we just thinking about compliance and control?
Yeah. And that is the question that we are still trying to answer. Man, but we could talk about this all day and still not get to that answer. That's just how complex this issue is. But I think this is a perfect opportunity to go right into the lightning round. Let's keep it light now.
Yeah.
Yeah, we've been going real deep. Let's time to keep it light. Get to know a little bit more about Ben. All right. Yeah. So, with all the disrupting you're doing, at the university level and even within your school, man, what's your self-care activity? I know you have your 2 kids, but like, what do you do to keep sane and to maintain that self-care for yourself?
Yeah. Well, one routine I have with my kids pretty much every day, right when I finish my work day at 4:00, is just getting outside, just going for a walk. And kids have a great way of like humanizing me, just with those small things, like those small moments of gratitude. When my daughter, early on, when she was just beginning to learn her words, just like going on a flower walk where she would want to stop, and literally like every little flower she wanted to stop and smell and touch, and just getting away from the technology, away from a Zoom, out of a building, even if it was just for 10-15 minutes. That's been a great like routine to have with them, of just getting out in that space. So that's one thing that I've enjoyed. Another thing has just been intentional around doing some journaling on what am I learning and how am I feeling with whatever I'm experiencing. And so that's part of this, my own goal of just trying to strengthen my own emotional intelligence. I read a book early on, right before the pandemic, called Permission to Feel. And it just really resonated with me on like the need for, like, the centerpiece of so much of this discomfort and the disrupting is my own lack of emotional literacy. And just the small ways of practicing that. Like, am I admitting I don't know? Am I talking with my kids about what they feel? Am I listening to what they're feeling? So for me, it's kind of that invitation to be more human. And so I think that's been good for me to, that self-care piece of my own harsh internal voice sometimes, about just knowing, hey, it's okay that, some kids turned off their screen today. It's okay that you didn't finish this grading. It's okay that you messed up in, countless ways, still having that self-compassion. So that's, I think it's been big for me. Yeah. So that's the self-care. A little longer.
Those are a lot.
I can be a little quicker. Keep the
say it again.
I can be quicker on the lightning question.
No, it's all good. I mean, it's supposed to be lightning, but man, people elaborate. It happens just about every episode, but it's all good. All right. Well, speaking of quick, I know you were a cross-country runner, so you had to be quick around the track, right? So I want to know from you, what was your best time ran as a cross-country runner, if you remember?
Yeah, I had to think about it. It didn't come to me right away. So in high school, our distance was 5K, and my best time, I think, was around 18:05, like a 5:50 mile or so. Okay. There were definitely people way faster than me, but I enjoyed it. For me, running actually became almost like a self-care, like that mental space to zone out and just run. But yeah, so that was 5K. Yeah, 18:05. In college, I actually did some running too. Did an 8K in 28:40. So around like a 5:50 mile. So pretty much the same pace. So I'm not that quick, but when I can hold the pace. And I guess one proud moment was actually kind of testing that when I ran a marathon. I ran the Boston Marathon and was able to qualify for that. And so I was able to keep almost a 7-minute pace for those 26 miles. But, with kids, different stage of life, I definitely am not running marathons right now. But yeah, it's a fun memory to look back on.
All right. Well, next question was going to be about a book that you're reading right now, but I think you mentioned a few books during our conversation, so I want to go right ahead to the last question, which is, if you can invite 3 influential figures, dead or alive, to dinner, who would they be?
I've heard this question and I realized I've never answered it. Like, I'm not sure why, or maybe it wasn't asked to me, but I just heard it. So it was a good question. I actually enjoyed thinking through this. So first person, Chimamanda Adichie. And actually, I haven't heard her speak to know how she pronounces it. So, apology if she's hearing this. But actually, I gave a shout out to her in a post I just made around the power of stories. And one of her TED Talks was, I think, my first exposure to her, just the danger of a single story. And
yeah, I watched that.
Yeah. So it's really powerful. And she just has a lot of, who she is and what she's about, and the power of stories, and her, her love for her country and giving back and empowering other storytellers is inspiring. So she's one. Another one is actually someone I studied about in my undergrad program called Dietrich Bonhoeffer. He's a German theologian who, basically worked to try to fight Nazism, and also really think deeply about, what does this mean for faith? Like, is religion dead? Is it over? Like, what does this mean? And being willing to ask really hard questions. So I researched him for, my thesis. But he's just someone who a lot of people from all walks of life have found resonance with in both like his approach and his commitment to both reflection and to action. The last one was Ibn Battuta. He's always kind of a hero I shout out when I teach world history. And he's the most well-traveled, world traveler, way more than Marco Polo and other people of his time at the medieval time. And, anyway, so I think one thing I would love to ask him, just as I'm digging into my whiteness and thinking about race a lot more, is, if I was interviewing him, hey, what would you have to say about a guy in Portugal, less than a century after you, constructing race and lumping a whole continent as black? Like, did you see that coming at all? Or just because, of course, he traveled all over Africa and other continents. And I'm wondering if he would be shocked or surprised, or knowing like, oh, actually, I predicted that, because when I wrote about Mali, like, people in Morocco didn't like it because we enslaved them. And so, we already had issues, and my own scholarship was being questioned in my day. So I'm not surprised. So that'd be an interesting conversation to have with him.
Wow. All right. That should be a great dinner discussion for sure. But man, Ben, are you sure this is your first podcast? You just seem like a natural. You seem like a natural. I just have to ask.
Oh, thanks. It's been fun.
Yeah, man, you definitely need to do more podcasts for sure. This definitely ain't the last one for you, but I appreciate you for being on the podcast. Before you do leave, and I know you're not like a super big social media person, but if people did want to connect with you, where can they find you on social media? If you don't mind sharing your handles.
Yeah. No, I just got one, just my name. It kind of keeps it simple. So it's BEN.BRUHN. And yeah, Instagram is the kind of the main platform I'm on right now. So I'd love to connect.
Yeah, well, thank you, Ben. And we're going to connect soon, brother. But appreciate the conversation as always. Always a great conversation with you.
Yeah, thank you.
All right. Now you have a good rest of your day.
All right. Thank you. You too.
All right, people. So we have just ended another fantastic episode of Identity Talk for Educators Live. And until next time, as always, we're going to wish you a good night, good afternoon, good morning, wherever you are in the world. And we're going to do this again another time. Peace out, everybody.